This episode of the animated series Peppa Pig has never been shown on TV. Peppa Pig, not the real Grandpa. The day was overcast. Gray clouds hung low over the pig family's house, muting the sunlight. A strange silence filled the air, broken only by the occasional rustling of the wind outside. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig were preparing for Grandpa Pig's arrival. Peppa and George ran excitedly around the house, eagerly waiting for him. Soon there was a knock at the door. They rushed to open it. Grandpa Pig stood on the doorstep, but he looked different. His eyes were too light, his skin too pale, and his smile too stiff. He stepped inside slowly, fluidly, as if he wasn't entirely in control of his own movements. When he spoke, his voice sounded distant, hollow. Mummy Pig gave him a worried glance but said nothing. The day passed uneasily. Grandpa Pig barely ate. He just sat at the table watching Peppa and George without blinking. His movements were unnatural, sometimes too abrupt, other times too slow, as if he were adjusting to his surroundings. Night fell. The children went to bed, but Peppa couldn't sleep. A sound came from outside her room. A soft shuffling. She peeked into the hallway. Grandpa Pig stood in the darkness. He wasn't moving, just slowly tilting his head from side to side, as if listening. And then Peppa noticed something terrifying. His shadow didn't match his body. It moved differently. When he took a step forward, his shadow lagged behind before copying him a second later. Peppa's breath caught in her throat. Grandpa froze as if he had heard her, and then his face began to change. His skin tightened, his eyes darkened, and his smile stretched too wide. Bits of his flesh began to peel away, like an old mask crumbling. Underneath, there was something else. Something thin, distorted, wrong. It took a step toward her. Peppa slammed the door shut. Outside, a low, dragging scrape echoed down the hall, as if something was running long, sharp fingers across the wood. Then, silence. But Peppa knew that thing was still there, and it wasn't leaving. This episode of the animated series Peppa Pig has never been shown on TV. Peppa Pig, the Strange Guest. It was a quiet evening at the Pig family home. Peppa and George were playing in their room, while Mummy and Daddy Pig were in the kitchen preparing dinner. The wind howled outside, and the rain tapped on the roof, giving the house a cozy, safe feeling. But suddenly, a strange silence settled over the house. Peppa stopped and listened. The room felt a little unsettling. She walked over to the window but saw nothing unusual. However, her gaze lingered on a small shadow near the door. The shadow was unnaturally long, as if someone had left it behind, but no one had entered the room. Peppa decided to go ask her parents, but when she approached the hallway, she noticed that the front door, which usually was tightly closed and locked, was slightly ajar, as if someone had just come inside. She looked towards the staircase. Something caught her eye. On the stairs stood an unknown figure, barely visible in the dark. At first, she thought it might be Daddy Pig, but the figure was too tall and too thin. And the figure wasn't moving. It stood completely still, staring straight at her. Peppa felt a strange unease. She backed away, but her eyes kept following the figure on the stairs. Gradually, it began to move closer, but its movements were not human. They were too smooth, as if something not quite alive. Soon, the figure was right in front of Peppa. It was completely black, with no discernible features. Only pale eyes glowed in the darkness, cold and eerie. Peppa froze, not knowing what to do when the figure took a step forward. Peppa jumped, ran to the door, and screamed. She couldn't understand why she hadn't heard any footsteps from this entity, as it stood right in front of her. But as soon as she turned around, the figure vanished, like a shadow in the night. Mummy and Daddy Pig rushed into the hallway. Peppa tried to explain what she had seen, but when they entered, there was nothing unusual in the room or the hallway. The door was, as usual, closed, and once again a complete silence had settled over the house. The next morning, the door was shut, and there was no sign of the strange guest. But Peppa couldn't forget its eyes. This series was lost and never shown on TV. Peppa Pig, The Descent into Darkness. The day started as usual. Sunlight filtered through the windows of the pig family's house, filling the rooms with a warm glow. The scent of breakfast lingered in the air and birds chirped outside. Everything was calm. Peppa was the first to step out of the bedroom, followed by George. As always, they headed downstairs for breakfast and cartoons. Everything seemed normal. The same walls, the same rug on the stairs, the familiar sounds of Mummy and Daddy Pig somewhere below. But as they took their first steps down, something felt different. The floorboards creaked too loudly. The air thickened, heavy like the moment before a storm. The stairs felt smoother than usual, as if someone had polished them in their absence. Peppa took another step, and suddenly the floor vanished beneath her. Her body was pulled into emptiness as if the stairs had never been there. She had no time to scream, just the feeling of being yanked downward at terrifying speed. George, following closely behind, disappeared after her. They were falling. For a moment, or perhaps an eternity. There was nothing around them, no walls, no ceiling, no floor. Only an endless, consuming black void swallowing them whole. The air was cold and suffocating. It felt as if they had fallen into the darkness itself. Then, impact. A dull, heavy thud. Peppa felt something hard and cold beneath her. Her breath was ragged, her pulse pounding in her ears. She reached out with her hands, touching the ground, damp, sticky, covered in something that felt like dirt, yet softer, almost like living flesh. The darkness remained thick, impenetrable. Her eyes tried to adjust, but nothing changed. There wasn't even the faintest glimmer of light. The air was stale, heavy with the faint scent of decay. The unease in her chest grew into something worse, pure dread. Somewhere below, deep in the unseen abyss, something moved. Not the wind, not dripping water. Footsteps, slow, heavy, purposeful. They were getting closer, rolling across the unseen ground, as if something massive was walking toward them. Then, silence, a stretched, unbearable quiet. And then, something slid nearby, software careful, very close. Peppa felt it before she saw it, long, cold fingers barely brushing against her shoulder. Too thin, too rigid. They lingered for a moment, as if studying her. The darkness shuddered. The ground beneath her trembled, the air filled with a deep, muffled sound like a distant rumble. Something was awakening. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It was alive. And then the world beneath them collapsed again. They were falling, deeper. And now something was waiting for them. Peppa Pig, the screen. It was a rainy evening at the Pig family home. Raindrops drummed against the windows and the wind howled through the pipes. Inside, the house was warm and cozy. Peppa and George sat on the floor playing with their toys, while Daddy Pig relaxed on the couch after a long day at work. The television flickered softly, filling the room with familiar sounds. Daddy lazily flipped through the channels, clicking the remote. But something was strange. The image on the screen trembled slightly, as if the TV couldn't focus. Sometimes the sound lagged behind, making the characters' mouths move out of sync. Daddy Pig frowned and tapped the remote against his palm. The screen flickered. At first, just a brief flash of static. Then the picture began to distort. The faces of the news anchors stretched unnaturally, their eyes turning empty, their voices muffled as if coming from deep underwater. Daddy Pig leaned closer, squinting at the screen. Suddenly, the television flared with a bright white light. A cold gust of air seemed to rush from it, and the room felt thick and heavy, as if something unseen was pulling everything toward the screen. The couch trembled slightly. Daddy Pig reached for the remote, but his fingers slipped. He tried to pull back, but something was dragging him forward. First, just a little, then with a sudden yank, Peppa and George froze, unable to move. They watched as Daddy Pig was pulled toward the screen. His feet lifted off the ground, his hands clawed at the armrests, his face twisted in terror. It all happened in seconds. The last thing they saw were his outstretched hands, disappearing into the flickering light. Then the TV glitched once more, and a dead silence filled the room. Peppa took a hesitant step forward. George clutched his dinosaur, his breathing shaky. The screen flickered again. And then, movement. A shadow shifted behind the static. A face, pale, distorted, with hollow eyes. It looked like Daddy Pig, but something was wrong. His lips trembled as if he was trying to speak. But instead of words, a low, muffled sound came through, the sound of heavy breathing. The screen flashed one last time before turning completely black. The house fell silent again. Only the rain continued to tap against the glass. Peppa slowly took a step back. The television showed nothing now, but Peppa could feel that it was still watching.